In this video lesson, we'll discuss the realities of Reconstruction in the South and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The passage of the three Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, delighted former abolitionists, but deeply disappointed advocates of women's rights. Women had played a prominent part in the pre-war abolitionist movement and had often pointed out that both women and African Americans lacked basic civil rights. The struggle for African American freedom and the crusade for women's rights were one and the same in the eyes of many women. During the war, feminist leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had temporarily suspended their own demands and worked wholeheartedly for the cause of African American emancipation. The Women's Loyal League had gathered nearly 400,000 signatures on petitions. Now with the war ended and the 13th Amendment passed, feminist leaders believed their time had come. They were in shock when the wording of the 14th Amendment, which defined equal national citizenship, for the first time inserted the word male into the Constitution in referring to a citizen's right to vote. Both Stanton and Anthony campaigned actively against the 14th Amendment, despite the pleas of Frederick Douglass, who had long supported women's suffrage, but believed that this was the Negro's hour. Women lost the battle with the 15th Amendment as well. The newly freed men now had freedom. Their friends in Congress had only haltingly and somewhat belatedly secured the franchise for them both. Both Presidents Lincoln and Johnson had proposed to give the ballot gradually to selected African Americans who qualified for suffrage. Moderate Republicans and even many radicals at first hesitated to bestow suffrage on the freedmen. The 14th Amendment had fallen short of guaranteeing the right to vote, but by 1867, hesitation had given way to hard determination to enfranchise the former slaves. By glaring contrast, most of the northern states, before ratification of the 15th Amendment, withheld the ballot from African American minorities. White Southerners naturally concluded the Republicans were hypocritical as a result. Having gained their right to suffrage, Southern African Americans men seized the initiative and began to organize politically. Their primary vehicle became the Union League, which was originally a pro-union organization based in the North and assisted by Northern African Americans. The Union League was turned into a network of political clubs that educated members in their civic duties and campaigned for Republican candidates. The League's mission soon expanded to include building black churches and schools and recruiting militias. African American women attended the parades and rallies common in African American communities during the years of Reconstruction and helped assemble mass meetings in newly constructed churches. But African American men elected as delegates to the state constitutional conventions held the greater political authority. They formed the backbone of the newly emerging black political community. At the conventions, they sat down with whites to hammer out new state constitutions, which most importantly provided for universal male suffrage. Between 1868 and 1876, 14 African American Congress and 2 black senators, including Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce of Mississippi, served in Washington, D.C. African Americans also served in state governments as lieutenant governors and representatives, and in local governments as mayors, magistrates, sheriffs, and justices of the peace. The sight of former slaves holding office deeply offended their one-time masters, who lashed out with particular fury at the freedmen's white allies. Former Confederates accused them of plundering the treasuries of the southern states through their political influence in the radical governments, and they were called scalawags. The carpetbaggers were supposedly sleazy northerners who had packed all of their worldly goods into a carpet bag, seen here and here, and had come to the South to seek personal power and profit. Most were former Union soldiers and Northern businessmen. The radical legislatures passed much desirable legislation and introduced many badly needed reforms. For the first time in the South, steps were taken to create public schools. Tax systems were streamlined, public works were launched, property rights were guaranteed to women, and many welcome reforms were retained by the all-white Redeemer governments. This was especially true in South Carolina and Louisiana, where promoters and pickpocket peddlers used politically inexperienced African Americans as pawns. This sort of corruption was by no means confined to the South in the post-war years. Many whites resented the success and ability of black legislatures as much as they resented alleged corruption. A number of secret organizations sprang up. The most notorious was the Invisibly Empire of the South, or the Ku Klux Klan, created in Tennessee in 1866. Be-sheeted night riders, their horses' hooves muffled, would approach the cabin of an upstart African American and hammer on the door, and was scaring the newly freed men from the polls. Such foolery and terror proved partially effective. Many ex-bondsmen and white carpetbaggers, quick to take hint, shunned the polls and would not vote. Those stubborn souls who persisted in their upstart ways were flogged, mutilated, or even murdered. The Klan became a refuge for numerous bandits and cutthroats. Congress, outraged by this night-riding lawlessness, passed the harsh Force Acts of 1870 and 1871. Federal troops were able to stamp out much of the lash law, but by this time the Invisible Empire had already done its work on intimidation on the voters. White resistance undermined attempts to empower blacks politically. The white South openly flouted the 14th and 15th Amendments for many decades. Wholesale disenfranchisement of the African Americans, starting conspicuously around 1890, was achieved by intimidation, fraud, and trickery, including literacy tests, which gave the advantage to the whites. The goal of white supremacy was fully justified with these dishonorable devices. We'll discuss more about the impact of the Ku Klux Klan in disenfranchising African Americans in our lessons in class.